it made me think about Putin's speech after the referendums, where he basically, and not only did he outline that Europe was on the way to collapse and that the whole collective West was on the way to collapse and that it's irreversible, but he also talked a lot about the danger of this kind of thinking, this mentality that still is driving the collective West, with the United States really pulling the levers. And so, I wanted to get your analysis of Vladimir Putin because, here, this is the left lens. And one thing I've noticed about the left, or what calls itself the left, especially in the West, the Western world, is that there's a lot of animus toward Vladimir Putin as an individual, toward Russian leadership. And the same could be said about China and basically any country that the State Department doesn't like. But focusing here on Russia, right? Because you all have been covering Russia for quite a long time. Could you talk about the significance of Putin here and what his leadership has meant in this moment? Because a lot of people, regardless of whether they're propagandized to think just like people like Borrell, or whether they're on the other side skeptical of this, this is a pretty monumental moment in history. And it seems like Vladimir Putin is really huge in this moment of history. So I want to know your thoughts about that, because I know you have been covering his speeches and his actions very closely.
But before Alexander answers, I'll just give my take real quick, and then I'll let Alexander take this, because I think Alexander will have an excellent view on Putin. I just want to say that Putin is a very hard president to cover. I mean, he is tough. It's hard to see what he's trying to do. It's hard to get into his head and try to figure out his actions. But he's also one of the most interesting leaders to cover. That's my take on Putin. I think he's a very difficult politician to cover, and I also think that much of the mainstream media doesn't bother to try and understand Putin. They don't bother to read his speeches. They don't bother to listen to what he says. They just demonize him right off the bat, and they just just there it is. He's a dictator. He's this, and we'll just leave it at that. But when you really start to try and dissect what Putin is saying and what you try to understand what he's thinking, I think he's one of the most fascinating leaders that we've actually seen before us in our lifetimes. I mean, he's tough. He is tough to try to get a hold of. Alexander?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just say, and following on from what Alex said, in the Middle East, in the Arab world, Putin is routinely referred to as Putin the Fox. He's seen as someone, who's sly and cunning and sophisticated, and exactly as Alex said, very, very difficult to read. And that's one of the problems with Putin, because he is very difficult to read. On the one hand, he talks a huge amount. I mean, he makes speeches every day. He meets his officials, he writes articles, he does all kinds of things. But he's very difficult to define, for example, in left-right terms. And I've seen some people say he's a president of the left. He believes in strongly interventionist economic policies. He's certainly not, contrary to what many people in the West think, a creature of the oligarchs. I mean, that is a misconception that many people on the left have in the West, and which also informs government thinking in the West. There was a widespread assumption that the sanctions would affect the oligarchs in Russia, and they'd rise up against Putin, and that they'd remove him, and that he was somehow their creature. It isn't like that at all. He's not a creature of the oligarchs. He's not even aligned with them in any significant way. He runs a very controlled economy. I mean, the Russian banking system is almost entirely state-owned. Many of the big companies are state-owned. The utilities are state-owned. Everything is very tightly regulated in Russia in that kind of a way. So some things might lead you to think he's politically on the left, in some of his economic policies. Other things, again, on economic policies, he's very careful about, preserving budget discipline. He's very fiscally orthodox. He doesn't like wild experiments with monetary policies. And of course, as well, though, on identity issues, he's a social conservative and makes no apology for it. So he's difficult to place on the particular political spectrum. And of course, there's the other thing. He dominates Russian politics, though it's a dominance which, when you are in Russia, seems less than it does in the West. This is the paradox. When you go into Russia, you don't see his picture on the wall everywhere. He isn't in every newspaper all the time. You don't see his picture hanging in people's apartments, as you used to have to do in Soviet days with Soviet leaders. There's no personality cult of that kind around Putin. And most Russians, most of the time, don't think much about Putin. Nonetheless, he does dominate Russian politics. And it's a complex thing because people in the West call him a dictator, but there's very little real coercion there. You meet Russians, they can say whatever they like. They can talk about Putin. They often do. Many of them criticize him. And yet, at the same time, he does have this very solid political position within Russia itself. And how does he manage it? How does he manage all of these different things? Well, the short answer is that to understand Putin, you have to understand that, yes, he's a very powerful personality. He's a very structured leader in some ways. If you follow his speeches, and by the way, nothing you ever see in the West which is taken from his speeches you should ever assume is true, because most often it's either taken out of context, or sometimes I've seen cases where things are attributed to him, which he's never in fact said. But anyway, all of this, to some extent, conceals the fact that he works always through consensus. He's somebody who, whenever he makes a decision, he does it very slowly, in a very incremental way. There's usually a massive process of consultation. Russian government structures are extremely complicated, and in fact, he never acts unless there is an elite consensus behind him. So that makes the process of decision-making maddeningly slow, and explains why, in Alex's words, it's so difficult sometimes to read. But it does also mean that when the decision is finally made, be it to give the central bank the right, for example, to float the ruble, which was this big decision which was taken in 2014, or the decision that was made in February of this year to actually send troops into Ukraine, there is always an establishment consensus behind it. So it's a mistake to focus on the man. He is a brilliant manager. He's a brilliant person in bringing together all these various different diverse elements in the power structure and hammering out the consensus. But when that consensus arrives, you can be fairly confident that the entire system is solidly united behind it.